Welcome, students. It's a grade 12 history screencast for looking at the reasons for German defeat. It's not the end of looking at World War II, but it's a good point now that we've looked at the Russian campaign to look at the reasons for German defeat, and that's why the hat is off my head now. So let's take a look at specifically why they're defeated, and it's going to be, most of this screencast will be with reference to Daly and Webb's outcomes and conclusions. So I popped up an image here that you can see is from the First World War, but it's got a lot of parallels with the Second World War in my mind. There's that failed offensive, which was Ludendorff's offensive in particular. There's also the failed Schlieffen Plan. Ludendorff's offensive actually almost won, and Haig, the leader of the British forces, had to issue a backs against the wall, or rather backs against the sea memorandum, just asking for every British soldier to fight and do what he could. Other things we see here are the lack of manpower in Germany in World War I. In World War II, they were running out of manpower also. The lack of food and resources at home, which was another problem. And then finally, which you know about already, is the huge difference in industrial output, both in World War I and in World War II, which created serious problems for Germany. Now, as we look at these images from the defeat, we can see the reasons are, as listed in your reading, that there are weak Axis partners in Europe. There is problems in war production. There's failed strategies, and then also the influence of Hitler. Then there's the USSR as the cause of German defeat, and finally the role of the United States and Britain in defeating Germany. And there's another factor that's not in the reading that comes out in Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, and it just relates to the Nazi regime as a whole and how they picked their leadership and for how they pick people to fulfill certain roles. And Dan Carlin says that if you take the Nazis out of World War II, the German army, in World War II, the German army, it instantly gets better. The two images are, the first one up above here is the German officers signing the defeat, and as they did in a train car in World War I. And then this is an image of Berlin, and Germany really was pounded to rubble in the war with the bombing and the battles that occurred. And I don't think there was much hope of there being a myth that they could have won as there was in World War I. Now, if you are curious about which army was better, and you've ever wondered, was it the Imperial German Army World War I or Nazi Germany, search for Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, Episode 1, Imperial Germany and Nazi Germany, and you'll find a fascinating comparison between the two. Now, let's look at some of these topics. One, weak Axis partners in Europe. This is a group of Italians surrendering to a British soldier in North Africa, and there were cases of a few hundred British soldiers actually capturing thousands of Italian soldiers. Italy was considered weak as an ally. Hitler didn't even think of them in the war plans, and when Italy did do things on its own, such as attack Greece, Germany had to come rescue them. Slovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania did contribute troops to the Russian campaign, about 1 million overall, but they were not the same quality of the German troops, and in fact, part of the defeat in Stalingrad comes from these troops not being able to hold off the Russian attacks. And then finally, there was Japan, who never declared war against Russia, so did not help open up a second front for Germany. And so while an ally in one way, I think really in name only in terms of practical assistance. Now, war production is another reason that's touted for the loss, and then we can see here is that Germany was not in a total war mode till 1943, and that's evident in this chart. If we go to Germany, we can see war production in 1940, war production in 1941 when they invade the USSR, and then in 1943 they ramp up to a total war of 13.8, which really is maybe where they should have been if they wanted to win. We compare that to Great Britain, who ramped up through the war, the USSR, who ramped up dramatically through the war. 41, they still would have been in their 5-year plans, but they could ramp up even more. And then the total here is 3.5, 19.5, and up to 62.5 when the powerhouse of the United States comes in. And that just does not compare to the total of the Axis combatants. Other things you can see is that Germany had disorganized production, lots of models and makes, not the huge factories producing just one type of, say, vehicle as they did in the United States, where they just had a huge number of Sherman tanks, or in Russia where they focused on just a couple types of tanks. And that's another problem that we talk about, the models of equipment. The Nazis never properly integrated the captured territories into its production system. They moved slave laborers around. In other cases, they kept native industries as they would have in Holland. But there was never really a clear program. And in part, that's due to poor Nazi administrators. And then finally, there's the foundation for this industrial or total war, which it was by the end. They lacked essential materials such as oil and iron ore, and that really hurt them in the end. Now, the Allies had tremendous economic success, and if I point you down to this chart right here, this is the pre-war production in the United States for merchant ships. So these are these Liberty ships or freighters, and by the end of the war, less than 5 years later, they had increased fivefold. So it just speaks to the economic power that the United States brings, and then there's also the economic power of England and of the USSR. And what we can see here is that the UK and USA were well organized for war production. The example is Lord Beaverbrook in the UK, a very successful businessman who is credited with, maybe overly credited, but really did help with aircraft production during the Battle of Britain, versus Speer, who the Hitler appointed to be in charge of his war effort, in a sense. Dan Carlin has some interesting comments, especially reading from Speer's book, which I wasn't able to find, but it's great on the internet when Dan Carlin's reading it. And Speer's just saying, I had no experience to do this. I was not an expert, and it just kind of speaks to the larger problem the Nazis had. Other aspects of Allied economic success: the USA was the largest supplier of oil in the world. The text says the USSR and its 5-year plans had prepared, and they used the word accidental, though I would argue that Stalin maybe saw himself in a war footing already with the Allies and the attacks that they'd made on his country during the Russian Civil War. There was also the fact that both the USA's and the USSR's production facilities were safe from Nazi and Japanese attacks, so they weren't disrupted. And then finally, there are these huge levels of industrial production, as well as the larger populations when you bring all the Allies in. Failed strategies would include things like the German military was well prepared and organized for rapid wars and quick victories. And in part, this was so that Hitler didn't disrupt the civilian life in Germany, didn't cause shortages, and so kept his popularity. There is, in terms of the invasion of the USSR, which you know, the failures in Barbarossa, and then the fact that the German army wasn't ready for the failures of Barbarossa, and it was only by 1943 that they shifted to a total war footing, which many would say was just far too late. And next, what we want to look at here is a quote from this man right here. This is Zhukov, and he said, "The Soviet Union nearly lost the war in 1941 and suffered from poor planning," according to Marshal Zhukov in the Frank television interview that had been banned since it was recorded in 1966. Remember, that was after the death of Stalin. Zhukov, the most decorated general in the history of both Russia and the Soviet Union, admitted that Soviet generals were not confident and that they could not hold the German forces at Morzyak defense line outside Moscow. So if the Germans had really pushed, they would have fallen. We also want to realize that Hitler was constantly intervening and undermining his generals, and so that also caused major problems. Hitler's military decisions, to segue from before, he had those early successes where he'd gone with gut instinct, whether it was in Poland or Czechoslovakia, where they pushed the Allies, or even that crazy plan to go through the Ardennes, which succeeded in France. He was often second-guessing and overruling his generals. There were the disastrous Stalingrad decisions, and also the changes when, rather than focusing and going into Moscow during Operation Barbarossa, he diverted forces north and south, which slowed down that attack. And then we can even see this characterized on D-Day, when the tank reserve could only be released if Hitler were contacted. And on the day of D-Day, they weren't able to get in touch with them until later in the day. Soviet strength. We can see some pictures here showing that. What we've got is that Germany had those various weaknesses that we talked about. and the authors are saying that the USSR directly caused the defeat. It was because they had this vast territory that was hard to occupy, hard to move supplies over, and just hard to conquer. There was the huge industrial potential of the Soviet Union, both for resources and for building. You can see that in this tank factory here. The huge potential in the people when they were mobilized. This is people digging defenses for Moscow, and you can see it's mostly females because the men are off doing either other jobs or fighting at the front. You had a nationalistic people, and it became a great patriotic war. You had a regime that was very nationalistic and also willing to take its people and throw them at the Nazis, however was necessary. There was also the fact that behind the lines for the Germans, there were hundreds of thousands of resistance fighters, which also links into that vast territory they had to defend against. The resistance fighters also came out of the Great Patriotic War and the barbarism showed by the Nazis to local civilians. And then finally, there was just the fact that these Russian soldiers were brave and tenacious. They wouldn't give up, maybe in part because they would be killed as prisoners by the Nazis, or they'd be shot by their own commissars and officers if they retreated or were captured. But nevertheless, they were brave and tenacious, and Hitler had never expected that from a non-Aryan people. Now, we have a question here. In the end, 80% of the lives and material lost of the Germans was at the hands of the USSR, not the Allies, not in D-Day. And why is this so? Was it the Soviet steamroller, that idea that they had millions and millions and millions of soldiers to throw forward? Well, in the words of PhD author Pennington, when you crunch the numbers, it turns out that Russian superiority was not so great as is commonly believed. Slowly and at great cost, drawing on a smaller available population than that of the United States, it was able to gain a 2-to-1 advantage over the Axis by 1943. But remember, it was already in 41 that they blunted the German attack, and then later on in 42 is when Stalingrad occurred. Now, what if? Let's take another look at another aspect here that's not brought up in the reading. What if we look at the fact that the Soviet Union should have by rights been defeated in the war, but it prevailed. This is by, I believe, Overy in your reading. Germany lost the war. The USSR did not win it. And that was a view of some of the German generals, maybe to explain why they'd lost. How could such a superior army, and for some, a superior race, have lost to these Soviets? And it wasn't because, in their mind, maybe it wasn't because the USSR was better, it's just because they'd made the bad mistakes. But maybe we need to consider that the German leaders never, ever anticipated, Hitler especially, that the USSR would recover its economic strength, reform its armed forces. Remember, it got rid of 40,000 officers before the outbreak of World War II, and produce leaders of remarkable quality, something maybe the Germans thought only they could do. So here's the summary page for the defeat. We can see that there are the weak Axis partners we talked about, the economy not prepared for a total war, not till 43. There was the overall Allied economic strength. There were those failed strategies and failed attempts. Maybe they never should have attacked Russia, or maybe it was just inevitable. There are those Hitler's military decisions that we've looked at in terms of Stalingrad and Barbarossa. And then finally, we dug into a bit there about the Soviet strength and a willingness to sacrifice soldiers to achieve victory. But they also became a very skilled army. Now, our next topic is going to be the fronts and mobilization. We'll look at the impact upon civilian populations, the soldiers fighting, the fights at home, if we're going to invest and protect, that's a Canadian poster. And then finally, the picture here that I'm moving away from is just the complete mobilization of people on the battlefields, the home front factories, the farms, the food, and the fact that the whole population is going to be involved in this war. Thank you.